$160 billion. Not taken through war, not seized through invasion, not stolen at gunpoint in the middle of the night. Taken through paperwork, through tariff schedules signed in Washington by a man who had already called Canada his closest ally. Through the quiet, systematic dismantling of the most integrated trade relationship in the history of the world. And for months, Canada said nothing. Ottawa sent the diplomatic notes, made the phone calls, stood at the podiums and used careful language and patient tone and the kind of measured restraint that career diplomats spend entire careers perfecting. While the money kept flowing out, while the factories kept going quiet, while the number kept climbing, then a new man walked into office in Ottawa. And he is not that kind of politician. He looked at what had been taken. He looked at exactly how it had been taken. And then he did something no Canadian leader had done before. He put a number on it, $160 billion. And he said, "We want it back." What happens next will define North American relations for a generation. And most people have no idea it's even happening. Stay with this. $160 billion. Let's make that number real. That figure is larger than the entire annual GDP of Hungary, larger than Ukraine's pre-war economy, and it did not disappear because of a recession or a pandemic or any kind of systemic shock that economists saw coming. It was extracted, deliberately, through trade barriers applied to a country that had done nothing to deserve them, justified by reasons that changed every few months. Here is how the mechanism worked. 25% on Canadian steel. That sounds like a technicality. But it meant that every ton of Canadian steel entering the American market cost 25% more overnight, not gradually, not after a phase-in period. Immediately, orders stopped. Contracts weren't renewed. Steel towns like Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie felt it within weeks. Then aluminum. Canada is one of the world's largest primary aluminum producers. American aerospace, automotive, and electronics had built their supply chains around it for decades. There is no rapid substitute. So the tariff didn't protect American industry. It raised costs for American manufacturers while giving them nowhere else to go. Economic self-harm dressed as economic nationalism. Then automobiles. 25% on vehicles assembled in Canada. A single car built in Windsor might contain an engine from Ohio, a transmission from Indiana, electronics from Michigan. It crosses the border multiple times before it's finished. Taxing the final assembly doesn't protect American workers. It punishes the entire integrated system both sides spent 40 years building. The justifications kept shifting. National security, trade deficits, fentanyl. Each one collapsed under scrutiny. Each one was replaced before anyone could push back too hard. None of it was accidental. The tariffs were the strategy. And when you add up the full cost across every sector, every disrupted supply chain, every displaced worker, the number you arrive at is $160 billion. That is what was taken. And the man who just became Prime Minister of Canada knows exactly how to read that number. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what existed before it. In 1944, before the war was even over, a group of economists and policymakers gathered in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. They had one question. If we win this war, how do we build a world that doesn't produce another one? Their answer was not military. It was economic. Nations that trade with each other, nations whose prosperity is genuinely tied together, do not go to war with each other, because destroying your trading partner means destroying yourself. That principle became the foundation of the entire post-war international order. And nowhere did it take deeper root than between Canada and the United States. 8,800 kilometers of shared border, almost entirely undefended. Not just a security fact, a philosophical statement. $2 trillion in annual trade. A single auto sector so integrated that one vehicle crosses the border multiple times before it's finished. Canadian energy powering American cities. American technology driving Canadian industry. This was not merely a trade relationship. It was, in virtually every meaningful sense, the same civilization expressed in two different national forms. That relationship had a governing document, NAFTA. Then the USMCA, which Trump negotiated himself in his first term, championed personally, and called a historic victory. It came into force in July 2020. It would take him less than 5 years to begin dismantling it. And through all of it, Ottawa stayed quiet. Diplomatic notes were sent, phone calls were made, carefully worded statements were issued. The Trudeau government absorbed each new tariff with the patience of a nation that genuinely believed the relationship was too important to destroy, that Washington would eventually come to its senses, that the rules still meant something to someone across the border. That patience cost $160 billion, and it created an assumption on the American side that would prove to be a serious miscalculation. The assumption that Canada would always, eventually, back down. Then everything changed. Mark Carney was not supposed to be a politician. He was born in Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. Not Toronto, not Montreal, not the kind of metropolitan privilege that produces most national leaders. A small northern community, deep inside a country whose vastness shapes you before you are old enough to understand it. He studied economics at Harvard, completed his doctorate at Oxford, then went to work at Goldman Sachs. Not on the periphery, but at the center of one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world. 13 years. London, Tokyo, New York, Toronto. In 2003, he joined the Bank of Canada. In 2008, he became its governor. What happened next is the part of his biography that defines everything that follows. The 2008 financial crisis was the most severe global economic collapse since the Great Depression. American banks had made catastrophic bets on the housing market. The contagion spread globally within weeks. Governments and central banks around the world were forced to make consequential decisions in real time, with incomplete information about consequences that would take years to fully understand. Carney's management of Canada's response was widely regarded as among the most effective in the developed world. Canada emerged with its banking system intact, bruised, but not broken. While American institutions were collapsing and requiring emergency government intervention, Canadian banks held. That does not happen by accident. That happens because the person at the top understood what was coming before most people were willing to name it. The international financial community took notice. In 2013, the British government did something it had never done in the 300-year history of the Bank of England. It's appointed a non-British citizen as governor. Mark Carney became the first Canadian, the first non-Briton, to lead one of the world's most consequential financial institutions. He then guided it through Brexit, through the currency shocks, through the structural uncertainty of a country dismantling its entire economic relationship with its largest trading partner in real time. He did not panic. He did not perform. He communicated clearly, acted decisively, and demonstrated under genuine pressure that he could manage systemic economic risk with a steadiness that the most demanding critics in the world's most demanding financial capital found credible. This is the man who looked at what Trump had done to Canada and understood it not as political aggression to be managed diplomatically, but as a structured extraction strategy to be dismantled methodically. He knew exactly what had been taken. He knew exactly how it had been taken. And unlike every Canadian leader who came before him, he knew exactly what to do about it. That made him a completely different kind of opponent. When Carney made the $160 billion demand public, the White House response was immediate and dismissive. Canadian demands were called unreasonable. Trump advisors suggested privately that Canada needed to understand who held the leverage in this relationship. There were comments, reported through multiple channels, that the people around Trump believed Canada would back down, as smaller economies facing American pressure almost always eventually did. As Canada itself had done before, they had made a critical error in judgment, because what they did not understand, what they could not have understood without knowing who they were dealing with, was that Carney had not made a demand. He had opened a strategy, and that strategy was already 3 layers deep before Washington had finished drafting its dismissal. The first layer was the retaliatory tariffs, and here is what made them different from anything Canada had done before. They were not broad, they were not symbolic, they were surgical. Carney's government targeted American goods from American states with mathematical precision, agricultural products from swing state farms, industrial goods from manufacturing communities that had voted Republican in 2024. The message was not delivered in a press release. It was delivered in the specific zip codes where the pain landed. Canada knew exactly which American industries were most exposed, exactly which senators and congressmen represented those industries, and exactly how much political pressure those industries could apply to the White House if the pain continued long enough. This was not retaliation. This was leverage, precisely applied. The second layer was credibility. And this one required understanding something about how Trump operates. Trump had spent his entire first term learning one lesson from his opponents. Their threats were not real. Apply pressure, and they fold. Make them uncomfortable enough, and they offer concessions. He had seen it work repeatedly, and it had shaped his entire approach to the Canada file. Push hard, wait for Ottawa to blink. Carney's team understood this assumption and designed every public move to destroy it. Each retaliatory measure was announced clearly and implemented immediately, with no ambiguity about whether it was real. No back channels suggesting flexibility. No diplomatic language that could be read as an invitation to wait Canada out. Every commitment was made in public, in specific terms, in ways that would be politically costly to reverse. The message, delivered not in words but in structure, was simple. There is no version of this where Canada backs down. Plan accordingly. The third layer was the one that will matter most in the long run: trade diversification. And this is where Carney's move stopped being a response to Trump and started being a fundamental restructuring of Canada's economic position in the world. For decades, approximately 75% of Canadian exports went to a single buyer: the United States. That concentration made perfect sense under normal conditions. The market was massive, the distance was minimal, and the institutional framework of North American integration made the two economies function almost as one. But it also created a vulnerability that Trump had just finished demonstrating in the most expensive way possible. A single buyer with enough leverage can change the terms of any relationship unilaterally. Carney moved to eliminate that vulnerability. Within his first 100 days in office, he made diplomatic visits to the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Each visit carried the same core message: Canada is a stable, resource-rich, technologically capable partner that is actively choosing to deepen relationships with democracies that share its commitment to rules-based trade. Not a country in distress looking for emergency buyers. A country with something valuable to offer, choosing its partners deliberately. The EU was particularly receptive. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the EU had been in force since 2017, but had never been fully activated. Carney's government moved to accelerate its implementation with a speed that signaled this was not a contingency plan. It was a strategic reorientation. The signal to Washington was unmistakable. Every new trade relationship Canada deepened reduced the leverage the United States held. Every percentage point of exports redirected toward Europe or Asia made the threat of further American tariffs less consequential. Canada was not just pushing back against what Trump had done. It was restructuring the board so that what Trump had done could never work the same way again. 3 layers: surgical retaliation, unbreakable credibility, long-term diversification, built simultaneously, implemented in public, by a man who had spent his entire career learning exactly how economic pressure works and exactly how to make it stop. Trump had pushed Canada expecting it to fold. Instead, he had activated the one Canadian leader in a generation with both the knowledge and the will to fundamentally reshape the relationship on Canada's terms. The question now is, what happens next? 3 scenarios are now on the table, and which one plays out will matter far beyond Canada and the United States. The first scenario is partial American concession. Trump walks back some tariffs, frames it as a negotiating win, and both sides find language that allows a face-saving settlement. This is the outcome most diplomatic analysts consider most likely in the short term. But it carries a consequence nobody is talking about. If Canada extracts a concession through this level of coordinated resistance, every mid-sized economy currently absorbing American trade pressure will have watched exactly how it was done. The playbook becomes public. The template gets copied. The second scenario is Canada wins outright. The $160 billion demand is acknowledged. A structured compensation framework is negotiated, and the USMCA is either reinforced or replaced with something that has actual enforcement teeth. This outcome would represent the most significant reassertion of rules-based trade since the WTO was founded. It would also mark the moment the world stopped assuming American economic pressure was unanswerable. The third scenario is prolonged stalemate. Neither side fully concedes. Canada continues diversifying. The deep integration of the North American economy slowly, permanently, begins to loosen. This is the scenario with the longest consequences. Not a dramatic rupture, but a quiet drift toward a less connected continent. And once that drift begins, history suggests it is very difficult to reverse. Here is what all three scenarios have in common. Canada is no longer the passive party in this relationship. That changed the moment Mark Carney put a number on what was taken and said, clearly and on the record, that the extraction is over. $160 billion. That is the number this confrontation is built around. That is the bill that has been placed on the table. And for the first time in this relationship, the person who placed it there has the knowledge, the credibility, and the strategic patience to wait for it to be paid. The reckoning has begun, and this time, Ottawa is not blinking first.